Hi, today I have pulled one of my lessons out of my Skillshare class to share with you guys. It is about the exposure, triangle, and camera modes. I do hope you find it helpful. And if you want to enjoy my full Skillshare class, there's a link below to that. You can get 1 month free of Skillshare and, of course, the class. I hope you enjoy my fancy aperture transition. Hi friends, this lesson is about the technical fundamentals of photography. We're going to discuss the exposure triangle, and we're going to discuss camera modes and settings. First, the exposure triangle. This is the exposure triangle. We have aperture, we have ISO, and we have shutter speed. First, let's talk about aperture. The aperture is the hole in your lens that light comes through. The bigger the hole, the more light comes in. The smaller the hole, the less light comes in. The aperture size is represented by a counterintuitive number. The smaller the number, the larger the hole. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole. The aperture also controls how shallow your depth of field is, or how much is in focus in your frame. Now let's talk about ISO. Your ISO is how sensitive your camera's sensor is to the light that is coming in. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive it is. Now a couple of things happen when you raise your ISO. One is your image gets brighter. That's to be expected. You also lose some dynamic range, your colors get all weird, and your photo generally gets more mushy looking. But you also introduce sensor noise, which is not to be confused with film grain. On digital, you get sensor noise. On film, you get film grain. Sensor noise is often regarded as being not so pleasing, while film grain is often regarded as being quite wonderful. ISO noise is a bit more digital looking, a bit more crunchy looking. Now, I think it's important to note that ISO noise is not necessarily something that needs to be avoided. It really just depends on the goals for your photo. And finally, we have shutter speed. There are little doors in front of your sensor that open and close when you push your shutter button, or the picture takey button. Those doors are your shutter, and the length of time that those doors are open is your shutter speed. This is also represented by a number, and the longer your shutter is open, the more light comes in and the more motion is introduced into your photo. Now, as you may be noticing, the whole exposure triangle can work together to change the look and feel of your photo. Now let's look at some photos to visualize this exposure triangle thing. First, we're going to talk about ISO. And what we have before us is a very underexposed photo. This photo is actually taken in a parking garage, but what I did with my camera settings was limit how much light was coming into the camera. The aperture was at f/22 and the shutter speed was at 1/8000th of a second. This is letting very little light into the camera. Now this photo is at ISO 100, but let's move to a photo that is at ISO 800. So you can just see the faint outline of the windows of the parking garage coming into view. This is ISO 1600, ISO 3200, ISO 6400, ISO 32000, and ISO 409600. Now we can learn a lot from this photo. Because the ISO is so high, or I have, in other words, had to push the gain so hard, it's introducing different effects to the photo. The photo is very soft, there's a lot of noise, and there's some weird color shifting that's occurring. The more light you're allowing to hit your sensor, the less your camera has to push in order to achieve a correct exposure, resulting in a cleaner looking image. Now let's talk about shutter speed and motion blur. Here's a couple more test photos that involve rain. Rain. Bad for the camera, good for the photos. The shutter speed on this photo is at 1/160th of a second, and you can see that it's created this very pleasing texture of rain. Now this photo was taken at 1/50th of a second, and you can see that the rain is so blurred now that it's actually becoming less prominent. Now with this photo, we go the opposite direction. Now we're at 1/4000th of a second, and the rain is completely frozen into visible droplets. Now there's nothing wrong with the 1/50th or the 1/4000th of a second photos, but I personally find the 1/160th of a second photo to be the most pleasing. These photos demonstrate that different photos give you different shutter speed sweet spots. It's not that if you want motion blur, you have to go to the slowest hand-holdable shutter speed possible, or if you don't want motion blur, you go all the way to 1/4000th of a second. There's a lot of play and creativity in the middle. Here are a couple more photos where we have rain coming off the roof. This one was taken at 1/50th of a second. You can see that the rain is rather blurred. And then this one was taken at 1/200th of a second. You can see that it's a lot less blurred, but also you can see that as the rain falls down, it becomes more blurred as it reaches terminal velocity. Very interesting effect, and I definitely prefer this one. Now let's talk about depth of field, or how much is in focus. With this photo taken at f1.8, you can see that the lights in the foreground, which we are focusing on, are in focus, and the lights all the way in the background are completely out of focus. Now to this one at f5, you can see the lights are a bit more in focus. And finally on this one at f9, you can see a lot of detail in the background. Once again, we're at f1.8, you can see that the sign is in focus and the background is rather out of focus. On to f5, you can see that the sign is in focus, but the background is now much more in focus. And finally, f9, the sign is in focus, the background is very in focus. Now I'm going to touch on file formats because it changes how much you can push your image in editing. The RAW format is the most flexible and you have a ton of data to work with in editing. The JPEG format gives you a sliver of the data that you would get with RAW and is a lot less flexible in editing. Here are two photos of the same scene where I intentionally blew out the highlights in the sky. What we're going to do is we're going to see if we can bring these highlights back. So let's start with the raw photo. You can see I'm in Lightroom pulling the exposure down, and a lot of the detail in the sky actually comes back. We have some clouds, but there are still certain points that are blown out. You can only push a raw photo so far. Here on the JPEG, I'm doing the same thing, and you can see that that sky is just not coming back. Very sad. Now this is where we want to take a look at our histogram. We'll talk about the histogram more in the editing lesson, but for now, take a look at the right-hand side. You see that line going all the way up? That's our whites. That is the sky. That means that those whites are clipping. The detail is not there currently. Now sometimes you can bring some of that detail back. As I move the exposure down on the raw photo, you can see that we're getting a lot of that back. It's moving downward into a white blob and moving to the left. That means we're getting the detail back. But you can still see that there is a white tower that just will not come down, and that means that that detail is gone. It's not coming back. As we move the exposure down on the JPEG, you see that once again we have a white tower of doom. But the difference between the RAW and the JPEG is that with the RAW, I was able to bring back a lot more detail than with the JPEG. Shoot with whatever you want, I'm just here to show you the limitations. Now listen, there's nothing inherently wrong with blowing out your sky. It just depends on if you want that or not, or if you want to be able to recover your sky in post or not. Now here are a couple of photos where we have the opposite problem. These are a bit too dark. Now what I've found is that shadows tend to be far more forgiving than highlights. But if you do underexpose your photo and you have to bring it back in post, you may end up with a degraded image, so I recommend getting your exposure as close to right on the street as possible. As we bring back the RAW, all the details come back and you see that we have a perfectly usable photo. As we bring back the JPEG, those details come back, we end up with a usable photo once again, but there are differences in what you're going to be able to do in the edit between the RAW and the JPEG. Okay, now let's talk about camera modes. The camera mode you choose will determine how much control you have over your camera settings. Now, if you're using a phone, which is great, you will probably be operating in more of an automatic-ish kind of mode, although you will probably have some level of touch control over your settings. There are also other apps that you can download that will give you more control. Now, if you're using a mirrorless or a DSLR camera, then you will be able to have ultimate control over your camera's settings, but that doesn't mean you don't have an automatic mode, and that's the first mode I want to talk about. Now, this mode has some real benefits. It will allow you to take the technical thought out of the equation completely and focus on composing your photos and being creative, or interacting with people if that's what you're up to. Then there's program mode, and I personally find this to be the most difficult mode to understand, and it's never been my mode of choice, but this is how it works. You choose a set point, and I use that term very specifically. You choose a set point for your aperture, which means you pick a point and the aperture number hovers around that point. It's not locked in the same way it is in aperture priority or manual mode, which we will get into in just a second. It will choose your shutter speed for you, and it will choose your ISO for you, or you can choose your ISO. I should also mention that from what I understand, P mode differs a little bit from camera to camera. Now, if somebody is just starting out and they want to step out of automatic mode, I would encourage them to step into aperture priority mode. It's a very simple mode to understand. I spent a lot of time in this mode over the years, and I think it's a great place to start if you want to begin to gain a better understanding of what is happening in the exposure triangle when you're taking photos. And like I said, aperture priority is very simple. It allows you to prioritize your aperture. Shutter priority is the same thing, but it allows you to prioritize your shutter. Now, in both of these modes, you can also choose the ISO manually if you like. But then there is manual mode. the most daunting mode of them all. But manual mode is great because it allows you to have full technical control over your camera as well as full creative control over your photos. If you want to start shooting in manual and you don't know where to start, what I would recommend is going out, setting your ISO as low as possible, putting your aperture at a very manageable place, something like f4, f5, and start pointing in different directions. Move around the environment while adjusting your shutter speed to compensate. And then set your shutter speed somewhere and start doing the same thing, but this time you're moving your aperture around. And then if the scene asks for more ISO, then you can push your ISO up. And by doing that, what's happening is you're teaching your brain how to deal with all three parts of the exposure triangle. And it will become intuitive, but it will take time and practice. So when I go out, I tweak my settings according to whatever environment I'm in, and then I also think about the goals for my photos that day. Say, for example, I want to introduce more motion blur into my shots. Well, like I said, I can do that by slowing down my shutter speed. And then I tweak my other settings to compensate. Or let's say I want there to be more in focus. I can change my aperture to something like f9 or f11 to allow for a deeper depth of field, more in focus. Bob's your uncle. Or all the way to f22, where everything is in focus, even the dust on your camera's sensor. But with all that said, that's about it for this one. To recap, today we spoke about the exposure triangle, which is made up of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. We also spoke about camera modes, which are made up of automatic mode, program mode, aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, manual mode. And we spoke about various other settings. All of these things allow you to control how your image looks and feels. Maximum technical freedom, maximum creative expression. Now, I want you to go out and experiment and come back and share some photos and share in the discussion what you learned. And in the next lesson, we will be talking about how to choose gear. Hope to see you there. Goodbye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and thought it was not terrible or painful, or, I hope it didn't bring up feelings of deep regret, anything from your childhood that, is not pleasant. So if you did enjoy that, or if you didn't, or whatever thoughts you have, if you want to share your questions or thoughts down below, I would very much appreciate that. I'd be happy to engage with you guys. I appreciate you watching this today. Links below to the class, once again, if you would like to see the whole thing. I will go now, and you guys will go now, I assume, unless you just want to stare at the page. You can do that. Whatever's good for you. But yeah, I'm definitely going to go. I have a lot of things to do today, and I will see you guys. I'll see you guys later. So, yeah. Go. Get out of here. Okie dokie. Yep. Gotta do stuff. Where's my to-do list? Oh, it's on my computer. It's on my computer. It's right here. I'm actually gonna be here.